Holloway Jr. Today's date is November 16, 1990, and this interview is being conducted in the Oklahoma Historical Society by Rodger Harris and Bill Welge. Judge Holloway, where were you born?
In Hugo, Oklahoma.
And give us a brief biographical sketch, if you would, sir, of your early days, education, and so forth.
Surely. Well, I was born at Hugo in June 23rd, 1923. My father had been county attorney there, and he was in the legislature. And after his election in 1926 as lieutenant governor, we moved to Oklahoma City in January, I believe, of 1927. I went to school here in the public schools, Culbertson School over in Lincoln Terrace. We lived on Northeast 17th. And I went there for the first 3 grades and kindergarten, and I went to Lincoln grade school, at the end of Lincoln Boulevard down here, for the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades, into Webster Junior High in the 7th and 8th, Harding Junior High in the 9th grade, Classen High School, the old Classen, back on near 18th and Classen Boulevard, where I was in high school. One of my fine classmates was Admiral William J. Crow. He was 1 year behind me, and we were both on the debating teams for Classen High School. I went to the University of Oklahoma and was there in 41 and 2 until I went in the Army in May of 43. Then I came back from the Army in 46 and finished up at OU. I went to Harvard Law School, graduating there in 1950. I worked with the Department of Justice in the General Litigation section of the Claims Division in 51 and 2. And then I practiced law here in Oklahoma City until I was appointed a judge of the Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit in September 1968.
Now, your law firm that you were involved with initially was?
Well, my father and uncle had a firm in 1951. My father, William J. Holloway, and my uncle, Stephen D. Holloway, and I was with them a few months before I went to Washington. After the war, I came back here and was with the firm of Crow and Dunleavy, as it's now known, a very fine group of attorneys whom I knew well, and V.P. Crow and Raymond Talbert and Calvin Boxley were 3 of the senior partners there, and I still, of course, have close friends in that law firm.
Now, what was your relationship with Senator Mike Mulroney?
We were fraternity brothers, Phi Gamma Delta fraternity. He, of course, my senior for several years, and I admired Senator Mulroney so much and got to be a close friend of his and his lovely wife, who's still living in Washington, you know. And I supported him and was so delighted with his success as a fine public servant for Oklahoma, whom I think he was one of our finest.
And you were appointed at what year were you appointed?
In September 1968. I was nominated by President Johnson in August the 2nd, I believe, of 1968, and confirmed on Friday the 13th, September 1968, and then I was sworn in. My commission is dated the 16th of September from President Johnson, but I was sworn in on September 26th, and then by Judge Alfred Murrah, and he flew me up to Wichita that night, and we started sitting the next day in Wichita on the Court of Appeals.
And do you recall your earliest experiences on the court there? Any particular cases that come to mind?
Well, yes, we had some very, very exciting and interesting ones. There was a civil rights case that came up from Wyoming concerning their football team. That was a very important case in our court called Williams versus Eaton, involving a civil rights claim and the discharge of some players from the team, some black players who brought a civil rights action. And it's a very important case in our court, and it was for the state of Wyoming and for the civil rights of those individuals, of course. I looked up a couple of cases, 2 that I authored that I'm very proud of, because perhaps because they were both affirmed by the Supreme Court. But one of them was a very important antitrust case, Aspen Highlands Skiing Corporation against the Aspen Skiing Company. This was a 1984 case that I wrote the opinion in, upholding an antitrust judgment involving the practices of some of the skiing companies there at Aspen. And then another that was a very interesting case to me was a First Amendment case called Grant versus Meyer, and it was affirmed by the Supreme Court. It was a case in which we had a challenge to the constitutionality of a Colorado statute that forbade by criminal sanctions the payment of any persons to solicit signatures on initiative measures, so that could not be done as it's done here, I think, in Oklahoma. And our court held, in an opinion I wrote, that that was a violation of the First Amendment rights of people who wanted to promote those initiative measures. And we held it unconstitutional, and that opinion was upheld by the Supreme Court. And of course, theirs is the leading opinion by Justice Stevens.
Any opinions that you were the author of that were not received well by the Supreme Court?
Yes, there were. Certainly are. I wrote one here in a case styled Craig versus Governor Boren. This involved a challenge to the constitutionality of our Oklahoma statute, in which young women were entitled to purchase beer at the age of 18, but young men not till they were 21. And it was attacked on equal protection grounds as a sex discrimination. Because of the evidence that as I perceived it, I thought the evidence bore out some contentions of the state that there was more danger and risk and experimentation by the young men. And so I wrote an opinion upheld by Judge Eubanks, but Judge Doherty dissented, as I remember. The Supreme Court reversed that opinion. And perhaps rightly so, under the more recent trend of cases under the Equal Protection Clause. So that's one that I certainly remember vividly as a loser.
During your term on the court, do you think there was a trend presented in terms of the kinds of cases, or several trends that started to show up during that era?
Yes, I do. For example, when I went on the court, we didn't hear ecology cases mentioned very much, whereas now suits are legion under the ecology statutes, of course. The suit under Section 1983, we call them, that's the civil rights statute under which individuals can bring suits against state officers or city officers if there's been an infringement of their constitutional rights. Those cases weren't very prominent when I first went on the court, but they have mushroomed, and there is a very large number of them now.
Now, would you say that the decorum has changed in the courtroom from the earlier days? Or?
No, I don't see that. The attorneys were and are, I believe, uniformly very courteous and proper in their presentation of their oral arguments. You know, our court being an appellate court, we hear no evidence. We just hear the legal arguments by the attorneys or by the individuals. Sometimes individuals choose to represent themselves as they may.
And how would you judge the caliber of the attorneys that you had the experience of working with?
I think that quite broadly that the attorneys in our court are very excellent in their presentation of their cases. They're very helpful to us. Sometimes the arguments are not as strong as others, but most of the attorneys present their cases very well. One big change that you might be interested in, we have a very large number of outstanding women who argue before us now, and that was not nearly as prominent back in 1968. And we now have two lovely ladies on the court, which we didn't have any, and we didn't have any before.
I wanted to spend some time during our interview and try to get back in a moment to your career, but of course we are very much interested in your father's career, Governor Holloway. And wanted to start out, if we could, with your recollection of your father's birthplace and his early biography, if you could.
Surely. Of course, that's all hearsay up till at least the time I'm 8 or 9 years old. But my father was born in Arkadelphia, Arkansas in 1888. He was the son of a Baptist minister, Reverend Stephen Lee Holloway, who was from Arkadelphia. And my mother was born in Paducah, Kentucky, and moved to Texarkana, Arkansas, and lived there. And she and my father were both at Ouachita. They actually met, though, and became engaged and married while they were living at Hugo.
Now, Ouachita College is a Baptist institution, is it not?
That's right.
Yes, sir.
It is.
And any of his classmates that you recall that later on became well known?
Very, very, definitely. Several of them, but prominently Dr. Henry Garland Bennett. Dr. Bennett, as a little boy, and my father as a little boy, were neighbors and grew up together, and they both went to Ouachita College, and they were friends from the fifth or sixth, from their age of 5 or 6, I've been told. And Dr. Bennett came to Oklahoma, and he was, I understand, the superintendent of the schools at Hugo. My father, he called to come there, and he was the principal of the high school, is my understanding. My mother then, they were looking over the applications of teachers, and my father said, why don't we hire this young lady? And that was my mother, Amy Arnold. And they became married in 1916.
I see. Now, your father's education, can you recall that for us, please?
Yes. He attended Ouachita College, where he got his Bachelor of Arts degree, and then he went to Cumberland Law School at, it's near Nashville, I believe, in Tennessee, where a lot of very fine attorneys here have gone. Judge Fred Doherty was a graduate of Cumberland. And you ask about other people that were prominent in state affairs, particularly Dr. Bennett, of course. But there were other men from Hugo whom I know and did know well, and one of them is Judge Paul Darrow Sr., who was the referee in bankruptcy here. And the Darrow family also was very prominent in Hugo affairs and been friends of my family since the teens.
Any other childhood friends that you recall of your father's that later on were well known? I'm thinking of Al Nichols, the
Yes.
senator.
Yes, indeed. Of course, that acquaintance became along in when my father was in the state legislature.
I see.
And he is Senator Nichols of Seminole, I believe, isn't he? Senator Nichols was there, and then Mr. Jim Nance, who was later a Speaker of the House of Representatives, knew my father well. But those, and then one other very prominent friend of my father's that he really respected was Judge Ross Risley. Judge Risley was in the state senate at the same time as my father. As you know, he was born in a dugout out in the panhandle of Oklahoma in Beaver County, and then he had a distinguished career as a state legislator. And then, as you know, he was in Congress for several terms, and then President Eisenhower appointed him to different offices in his administration. And then as a CAB member, he was chairman, as I recall, of the Civil Aeronautics Board. We've had 2 prominent men at least who've been there. Josh Lee was on the CAB. Then Judge Risley was appointed a federal judge by President Eisenhower, as you know, and came back. But they remained close friends all of Judge Risley's and my father's lives.
How old were you when your father was running, or actually was running for lieutenant governor?
I was 3.
You were 3, so you have little recollection of any of that. Do you?
Very little.
Do you recall the governor's mansion?
I do. I do that because, you see, my father didn't take office as governor until January, late January, I believe, of 1927. 1929. He became lieutenant governor in 1927.
Do you recall your father talking of his experiences in the transition from lieutenant governor to governor?
Not very much. I really don't. You see, I don't believe there was an inauguration since he succeeded the governor who had been removed. And I don't think they had an inauguration. He was just sworn in and took office and started to work.
Do you recall him talking of Henry Johnson, or?
Very little, really not much, because I wasn't involved in those debates, of course, and didn't, being just 7, I guess I was 6 in 1929, I didn't really have a close understanding of what all was developing. But the trial went on for the impeachment, of course, I think in late 28 and early January 29, and then the Senate trial was held, and my father took office then in late January. I don't remember much of that.
I see, and he didn't reflect later on that at all then?
No, he didn't. He really didn't. He talked to me a lot about some of and I remember some of the other things he did at that period and after. I do indeed.
And did he discuss to your best recollection the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, regarding his decision regarding his continuance as governor?
Yes, he did. He did. As I understand this from my aunt, Mrs. Stephen Holloway, the opinion of the Supreme Court was handed down really in a case involving Governor Trapp, who was a close friend of my father's and whom he respected so much. And Governor Trapp, as I understand, was contemplating running again, but the Supreme Court held that under our Constitution, even though he succeeded and didn't serve a full term, it would be succeeding himself. And therefore he was not allowed to run under the decision of the Oklahoma Supreme Court. But the opinion of the court came down after the filing date. My father wouldn't run against Governor Trapp. That's my aunt's recollection, and I'm sure she's right. So he had filed for lieutenant governor. He actually would have, I think, run for governor in 26, but he wouldn't run against Governor Trapp, so he had to file for lieutenant governor. The decision came down too late, and he couldn't, he could have actually run, you see, because Governor Trapp was not allowed to run, but the decision came after filing dates. That's what my aunt told me.
I see.
And
so he was
makes sense.
So he was seriously contemplating that.
Yes, he was.
Time.
That's my understanding, and I wasn't in on the political conclaves about this, but that is my understanding. And then, of course, the decision barred him from running.
Do you recall him discussing what encouraged him to become active in state politics?
No, I don't. I really don't. He was county attorney there, and it was a natural thing with a lot of attorneys to run for the legislature, and he did, and was in the state senate then, and he liked that work very much. And we moved up here, of course, when he became lieutenant governor, because that required more time.
Do you recall your father mentioning anything about Lou Wentz and his appointment to the Highway Commission?
I do indeed. My father was very ambitious to try to raise the stature of the State Highway Commission. And he therefore wanted to get some outstanding men, and in those days women weren't really participating in public office much, but he did look very much for an outstanding man, and as I understand, he was appointed chairman of the State Highway Commission. And my father was very elated when Mr. Wentz agreed to accept that job, because he knew, as a prominent Republican, and with there being that way a bipartisan membership of the commission, that it would raise the respect and stature which was needed for the Highway Commission. And he has told me many times he was very grateful to Mr. Wentz for taking that position.
Have you kept up with Mr. Wentz's family at all?
No, I haven't. My wife, as a coincidence there, he had a summer home in Colorado at the same lake near Buena Vista where my wife's family was. So they were friends with Mr. Wentz. I have not. I didn't know him, and these things are things my father told me about his friendship with Mr. Wentz.
Now, did your father speak of Governor Murray at all?
Not very much. I think they were in disagreement on some political views, particularly about President Roosevelt, and so they were not very close in political views. I don't mean there was personal hostility, but naturally with some disagreements they were not intimate friends, and or they were not, and he didn't really speak very much of Governor Murray to me.
I take it by what you said that you're suggesting your father was supportive of President Roosevelt.
Very much. I remember he came back from a governor's conference in 1930 and told our family, he said, that gentleman, President Roosevelt, had addressed the governor's conference and given the outline of his dream of Social Security as governor of New York. And my father came back and said, that man will be president. And of course, a lot of people were predicting President Roosevelt's rise in American affairs, and it occurred.
Now, during your father's administration, the Historical Society building that we're in today was constructed.
Yes, I remember.
Do you recall any comment he might have made about that?
Just his general pride in the development of the institution and his admiration for the preservation of the history of the state, but not details. I'm sorry.
Any other political issues that your father was involved in later on that you have a recollection of?
No, I think not. I do not know of any other particular issues. As you know, he didn't further carry on a political career. There were some friends of his that were urging him to run for the United States Senate, I believe in 1934. But he made a studied decision that he wouldn't run for the Senate, and did not.
In doing some rather superficial research regarding your father, we found a rather quiet and positive comment always about your father in terms of his being rather diplomatic and well-liked and that sort of thing. No criticism whatsoever, or negative comments even, which I think is rather unusual for an Oklahoma governor to have achieved.
Well, he was trying very hard. There had been some unhappy and unfortunate disturbances during the prior administration. So he had a lot of friends. I believe my father carried all 77 counties when he ran for lieutenant governor.
Really?
That's the recollection of my cousin Arnold Mosley of this city, who's still living, and he and my uncle Stephen Holloway campaigned with my father, and their recollection is he carried all the counties.
So your father continued to practice law then after
He did.
leaving the...
He did. He had one public position of sorts, and that was he was very interested, along with Governor Marland, in the establishment of the Interstate Oil Compact Commission, which is very important to the industry in Oklahoma, which was very important, I think, to the whole region of the Southwest as an oil-producing area. And he was appointed attorney for the Interstate Oil Compact Commission, and I remember our going to their meetings like at Santa Fe, I think, in '35. Governor Marland appointed him. He was a close friend of Governor E.W. Marland.
And did he have any recollections of Governor Marland?
Yes, he did very much. He admired him a great deal as a fine business leader of Oklahoma. I remember vividly going to the unveiling of the Pioneer Woman.
Really?
We have, in fact, here one of the bronze statues that was struck, a small one, of the Pioneer Woman. And we have a picture further of my father in front of the WKY microphone making the address there on the unveiling. But of course, a very prominent man there was Will Rodgers.
Yeah.
I remember his address and his talking about this lady with this very severe corset who was in the statue. Will Rodgers made his usual good-humored address there. It was a wonderful occasion, that unveiling. I remember going. I remember Judge Ralph Thompson, our chief judge of the Western District here, his father was there. His father went as a military aide. He was a very prominent military figure here in Oklahoma, and he went to the unveiling as well. And I forget who. I believe Mr. J. Perry was there. My recollection is he was, and I think Jay and I visited about that since.
I have read accounts of that unveiling, and in some of those accounts they are somewhat critical of Will Rodger's comments that day. You don't have that recollection?
No, he said they were just humorous. As a boy, all I can remember is his good humor.
Yeah.
But that may be.
Well, I think these accounts may have been in retrospect, so that may account for that. The properties there in Ponca City that belonged to Governor Marlin, did you recall having visited those and so forth as a younger person?
Yes, I remember going to they gave us a sort of a studio, was turned over to my father and our family, and I thought it was great. It was a marvelous place to play around, and they had sumptuous quantities of food there for us. It was just a happy day.
Yeah. By studio, that was a separate.
There was a separate building. At the back. Now I haven't visited back to the mansion there, but it was preserved, and then one Carmelite sisters had it for a time, and I think they still are trying to preserve Governor Marlin's beautiful home there.
Any other governors that your father became close to that you recall?
Yes, I do. He did not support in the election, as I remember it. He did very much admire Governor Turner, but he was not as close to him as he was to Governor Kerr. He supported and helped Governor Kerr in his campaign and for the governorship, and they were very close friends throughout Governor and Senator Kerr's career, and particularly he admired Senator Kerr's very strong and powerful leadership in the United States Senate.
Does he recall any humorous stories about Governor Kerr?
Well, they went fishing up in Minnesota, and I think Dad was having a big time out fishing with them. I think they were at one of those beautiful Gull Lake, I think, is where the Kerrs had this beautiful home, and Dad was napping off, and it turned out he caught the biggest fish that day. Is the story I'd heard. But he enjoyed always being with Governor Kerr. They were very close.
And they stayed in contact after Robert Kerr became senator as
yes,
well.
They did very much.
And Governor Turner as well? He became.
Yes, he did know and admired Governor Turner. He was not as close with Governor Turner as he had been with Senator Kerr. And of course there was a big political battle between the two of them in, I believe, 1954, wasn't it? Or was it 54 when Governor Turner and Governor Kerr were embroiled in that race for the United States Senate? Very tight race in Oklahoma affairs. My father was supporting Senator Kerr.
Did your father continue to be fairly active in state level politics?
Not really. He was practicing law, representing several different oil and gas clients, and he actually did not take part in public affairs. After probably the latest thing that you would say he did was his position as the attorney for the Interstate Oil Compact Commission.
I see. I've noticed a number of comments regarding his friendship with Fred Jones, and wonder if you recall any of that.
I surely do. Mr. and Ms. Fred Jones were both very close friends of my father's and my mother's, and we've admired their lovely family all through the years, and their wonderful son who was lost in the accident, And he did think Mr. Jones, both in Oklahoma and in national affairs, was one of the finest businessmen that we have, and he knew him well. There's another man I failed to mention that maybe you want me to, is General Baird Markham. It occurred to me because they were close friends of the Joneses too. But General Baird H. Markham, who was in the National Guard, and I saw a picture with Judge Doherty yesterday that we had a picture of General Markham back at one of the summer encampments of the 45th Division. General Markham was a very close friend of my father's as well.
I have noticed in the newspaper accounts of your father's death and so forth a rather amazingly popular accounts of his service to the state. Again, as I mentioned earlier, somewhat surprising that an Oklahoman Oklahoma governor has survived without any criticism to speak of. They described him as somewhat of a peacemaker for that decade of trouble that was going on.
Well, I think that was his ambition, and he had some success in reform. And at his eulogy, I remember our minister mentioned him as being a fresh breeze in Oklahoma affairs in 1929 and 30. So I do think that's correct. I'm very proud of that fact, and I think that the reports were good. We had a lovely group of tributes for my father when he passed away in 1970.
Would you consider your father's position to be perhaps an advantage in you obtaining the positions that you have in your?
Oh, very much so. He had a very warm relationship with the congressman from our part of the state, who was Speaker Carl Albert.
Right.
And so I got to know Mr. Albert well. He did know, actually I knew Senator Monroney perhaps as well as my father because of our friendship in fraternity affairs and others, but he did support and admire Senator Monroney very much. And he did urge them to consider my name as one they would recommend to President Johnson, and I was very fortunate. They were both very strong supporters of President Lyndon Johnson, and I'm very proud they felt they could recommend me to him and that he saw fit to appoint me.
Do you recall any recollections about Carl Albert in particular?
Very much, I do. I would visit him in Washington on my own when we've been involved in matters where we needed some legislation involving the courts. I've been to see him with another judge of court. I remember Judge McWilliams and I went to see Mr. Albert. He was a majority leader then, and we were very concerned about some legislation, and he was certainly kind to hear us out and help us.
So your relationship was more on a professional level with him. I'm not saying you didn't have a personal relationship, but that tended to be the contact.
Yes, more professional, but it certainly evolved from a close personal friendship. My father had supported Mr. Albert through his races for the House through all the years, and we were so thrilled when he, with his friendship with Speaker Rayburn, was favored later to become the majority leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, and then of course later Speaker. I believe our highest office held in national affairs by an Oklahoman.
Yes. Well, we certainly appreciate your willingness to participate in this interview, and on behalf of the Historical Society, we express our appreciation for that. Is there any item or concern that we might not have covered that you would like to include in this interview?
I think not. I just admire the society so much, the Historical Society and the state of Oklahoma. My father, I'll just say one thing, my father always felt a great debt of gratitude that he had been honored to be the governor of the state, and he always felt that he owed the state and his party a great deal, and felt a lot of continuing loyalty to both. And I'm grateful you've invited me to be here. I'm glad to do it.
Well, we thank you again, and this concludes our interview with Judge William J. Holloway.